Privileged this morning to have with us five very special guests. They are Mrs. L.D. Motter, her sister, Mrs. Mame Gillette, Mrs. Arthur Mildred Walker, and then we have Ernest Smith, a local lawyer, and Ed Shaw, a local accountant. And we are here for the next 55 minutes to talk about Henryetta and the past 50, 60, 70 years of its history. The individuals we have on the program this morning are part of the history of Henryetta, and we feel that we will get a very good account here on Henryetta Saturday. The Henryetta celebration, of course, started yesterday, continues throughout today, and throughout tomorrow. Now, one of the outstanding parts of the Henryetta celebration is the review of Henrietta's history in pictures and objects at the National Guard Armory. And we have not pictures, not objects, but we have people this morning to talk about the early history of Henryetta. I would like to start out by asking Mrs. L.D. Motter, first of all, when did you come to Henryetta, Mrs. Motter?
We moved here in 1910.
1910, so you sort of grew up with the city of Henryetta. Now, I understand, Mrs. Motter, that your father was very prominent developer here in Henryetta. Tell us a little bit about your father and some of the things that he did for the community.
Well, we came here and visited. My uncle came first, and he was very anxious for us to move here. So we came out and visited for Christmas. Then we went back home and got ready and moved out here in 1910. He was in business in Arkansas, so he had to sell some of his property. So he came out with the intentions of investing in property here. He built some buildings on Main Street, and he bought some buildings on Main Street. He bought 4 buildings on the south side of Main Street in the 500 block, and there was 3 on the north side. They were rock buildings, and they are now where, on the north side, where the American Exchange Bank is. On the other side of the street, there are 4 nice brick buildings.
Do you recall right now which businesses are in those buildings now?
Well, the American Exchange and the Wells Insurance Company occupy the north side.
Mm-hmm.
And the Ben Franklin and...
Would it be on up the street? On
no,
up the street west?
One's on Main Street on the north side,
I
those
see.
3.
Uh-huh.
And 4 on the other side. They all burned, on the fourth side, on the south side, the 4 burned to the ground. We didn't have a water department, so the bucket brigade could not possibly save them. I have pictures of them, and you might be interested to see them later.
Surely,
or now,
we'd be glad to see
anytime.
those pictures. May I talk to your sister just a moment, Mrs. Gillette? Mrs. Gillette, you, of course, came to Henryetta probably the same time, 1910?
No, I came much later.
You came later. Tell us
I lived at Vian for 10 years.
I see.
And with my husband and I lived there. And then after he died, we came to Henryetta in 27. But I had been coming here ever since the family was here, you see, in 10.
Mm-hmm.
And so I knew kind of what went on pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Mrs. Gillette, what was your first impression of Henryetta? Do you remember when you first got here? Do you remember what...
Well, of course, I liked it very much because the family was here and I entered right into... and I've been here ever since.
Mrs. Motter, you made a comment before we went on the air about your father making a comment about Henryetta. I think, were you in Oklahoma City at the time that this...
Yes, we had gone over. My other sister was in the hospital over there. We were walking down Church Street in Oklahoma City, And he said, "Sister, I've made a terrible mistake." I said, "What do you mean, Daddy?" He said, "Well, we never should have stopped in a small town like Henryetta. If there's a town there, we'll have to help build it. We should have come to Oklahoma City." But he had already invested.
So he, of course, did stay in Henryetta and did help Henryetta
These are the
grow
same,
and
the old Rock Hotel.
and develop. Mrs. Motter, let me ask you what your first impression of Henryetta was. Do you recall when you first?
Well, it wasn't as big as the little town I came from, Atkins, Arkansas.
I see.
And of course, I knew everyone and I liked it. There was his little store there. It's a hardware store. However, he had the undertaking, and on another street, on Dover Street, he had 2 nice brick buildings, and he had built the Opera House for the shows and things that came to town. This was our home. It was ready for us when we got here in 1910.
Mrs. Motter has a lot of very, very interesting pictures. This picture here shows a building burning, and it says the burning of the Reynolds Brothers building. Now, which building is that? Where was that?
Here they are, right here.
Okay.
They're on the south side of Main Street.
On the south
Now
side
there.
of Main Street. This is the original building right here.
That's
is that
the
right?
original building,
This is
and
the one
that's them burning.
And what is in that location right now, Mrs. Motter?
Well, the Ben Franklin store is on the corner in the 2 buildings.
Okay, so that would be the corner of 5th and Main there. On
Yes.
They're in the other 2. They're in all of it.
Okay.
Yes, they got
So that would
all
be
of it.
the southwest corner of 5th and Main Street right there. Okay, we've got that placed. And that was originally the Reynolds Brothers building, and
Yes.
that burned, and now the Ben Franklin store is located there. Burned in 1912, Ernest tells
That's
me.
right.
Let me ask you, did you ever answer what your first impression, did you finish your answer of what your first impression of Henryetta was?
Well,
Tell about riding with you, Henry. That was your first.
well, that was when I visited here before we moved here, and I was a little girl. And my uncle's store was in just a little frame building. There was just frame buildings on Main Street. I don't know how many years, but a few before we moved here in 1910.
Mm-hmm.
And Hugh Henry come riding in the store on his horse. And my uncle introduced him to my father and me. And he said, "Well, put that girl up behind me. I'll take her up and down Main Street." And here we went down the muddy street. No sidewalks, no paving.
We should point out that Hugh Henry is the man after whom Henryetta was named. He and his wife, I believe her name is Armida, and somehow or other they shortened it and it became Henryetta, the town that we have now. Let me ask Ernest Smith to come in here now and discuss with us a little bit about some of the, well, of course, I think you were born here, am I correct?
Yes, that's right.
And I believe your folks were already here, of course, naturally, if you were born here. And so you kind of grew up in Henryetta. Tell me a little bit about some of the early things that you can remember. In fact, tell us all. I think we'll just throw this thing open, and anybody that wants to talk can bring back old memories. That's what we want to do. Ernest?
Well, of course, I don't remember much about the teens, the 1915, 16, 17. I was born in 1915 here. I just, like any youngster, have only smattering remembrances of the community during the period of World War I, and immediately after that. I can still remember some of the things that went on in the early 20s. I can remember we had the 3 or 4 banks on Main Street. We had the place where they took the trolleys up. I think Mrs. Motter and Mrs. Gillette can probably tell you about the interurban that used to run. We had the King Cole Carnival. I can remember the King Cole Carnival in the early 20s. I remember it in the eyes of a boy. I can remember they had the merry-go-rounds and the Ferris wheel, and the whip, and Caterpillar. And whatever happened to the caterpillars? It looks like a caterpillar would be popular today. Do you know what a caterpillar is, Mike?
I think it's one that wasn't it sort of a ride that you used to take that used to whip around and.
Well, the main thing is it covered, you know, as you rode. It had a cover that went over the top of the people riding in these little cars on the caterpillar, and it went up and down and over the.
Popular with teenagers.
It was popular with teenagers, and I dare say would still be popular. Basically, Mike, my principal remembrances, of course, will be in the 20s rather than prior to the 20s. If you want to go earlier than that, you'll have to get it from Mrs. Motter and Ms. Gillette. Now, Mildred Walker was here during the same period that I was here. Maybe that's not quite fair to say this morning, but it's true nevertheless. Mildred and I went to school together, and she might have maybe a more vivid remembrance of some of those early periods.
Mildred, I want to reserve a section of the program a little bit later on, talk to you especially about your Hardin collection of pictures, but right now, you have anything you can add to what Ernest has said?
Well, I've got a year seniority on Ernest. I was born in 1914, so that's my first view of Henryetta. Of course, my mother was here way before the turn of the century and then came back about 1900 and has been here most of the time since, except for very brief times out of the town for a month or so at a time, and it just happened she was gone from Henryetta long enough for me to be born and came right back. So I can't say I was born in Henryetta, but I know that we did live on 3rd and Gentry, where the Roy Hinton home is now, when I was 1 year old, and right now I live right across the street from it. So it took some 50 years to get back to that old corner.
Let me ask Ed Shaw now. Ed, I won't ask you your age, but I'll just ask you if you date about the same time that Ernest and Mrs. Walker date from.
I won't tell exactly how old I am other than to say that Ernest and I were born on the same day, and I'm 4 hours older than he is, so that makes him he's the junior member of this group. But he and
you have 4 hours seniority over him, I see.
And I never let him forget it either. But he and Mildred and I all went to school together here. But I'm a latecomer to Henryetta. I'm not considered one of the early residents because I didn't move here until 1926. We came up from Wetumpka, and my dad came here superintendent of schools then. And we lived here from 1926 until 34. But those were right interesting times in there. Of course, they were the beginning of the Depression, the bank closings, the stock market crash. And I think during that time I had the mine disaster here and our famous train wreck on the Frisco, you know.
Well, let's talk about
like those.
Tell us a little bit now. See, I, of course, have only been a Henryetta now for a little over a year. Tell me about the mine disaster and the train wreck.
I can't give too much detail on it other than I remember that it was shortly after we came here, probably within a year after we came here. I don't even remember the name of the mine, but
Whitehead number 2 was
Whitehead number 2. But it was flooded, and many men were trapped there, and it brought quite a bit of publicity at the time. I remember the newsreel cameras out there set up and taking pictures of it, so we were on the early day newsreel in the movies.
Do you remember that? The Cameron, was it the Cameron?
Well,
I
yes,
believe
but
it was,
I
but
mean
I'm not
about
sure.
the mine disaster. I don't remember how many men were trapped down there or how many got out.
Well, they all got out of it. And nobody was lost in the disaster. We had a miner and whose name escapes me who went in through another mine and led them out. So we actually lost nobody in the disaster.
That was down by the Coal Creek instead of Whitehead number 2.
Yes.
It probably was the Cameron.
May I ask a little bit about the train wreck now? Now, I have seen pictures, I believe. Do you have, Mrs. Walker, do you have some of those train wreck pictures displayed?
Yes, I have quite a few, but I have many more at home. The man that caused this wreck had been fired by the Frisco, And he was seeking revenge and expected the freight train to go through. But for some reason, the freight train didn't come through, and the passenger train did. By throwing this switch, he was responsible for the death of 13 people. There was 11 blacks and the engineer and fireman. Many more were hurt, and I heard Jake DeLasta say he was delivering ice that morning in his old ice wagon and heard the commotion and went down and threw the ice out and carried people to the hospital in the ice truck. So that was real interesting. It happened on my birthday, so I was real, that's something I remember.
What year was that?
In 28, I believe.
1928, and 13 people were killed. Can you pinpoint where this train wreck happened?
Yes,
for
it
us?
would be practically on I-40 now, because it was down along between, I would say between 7th and 8th on Corporation, below Corporation, by the old Texaco pump station, which isn't there anymore.
In other words, right there where the interstate goes over 7th Street or 8th Street,
Well, it
in
would
that
be
vicinity.
closer to 8th than 7th.
It's where earth movers have their
I
headquarters.
see, And how many, do you remember how many cars were involved in that? How many train cars were?
Oh, wow, it looks like 3 or 4 or so. Of course, I don't remember from my own memory, except that my pictures that I've been going over now, I would say, how many, Ernest? Probably at least 3 or 4 or 5, maybe.
The fatalities were caused by the front car, which you will recall that unfortunately in our history we had what we called a Jim Crow car. And the front passenger car was propelled forward alongside of the engine, the steam engine. And Mrs. Modern Ridge Gillette, I know, will remember this. And the front car was filled with steam from the broken boiler in the engine. And these people actually died right in their chairs and instantaneously from steam.
Some of them jumped out in that water there,
Yes.
Boiling water.
trying to get away from it. Oh, it was terrible.
In other words, it was really the steam that killed them rather than maybe the crushing
That's right.
effect of the crash itself. This happened just a few blocks, well, probably within viewing distance of your home, didn't it, Mrs.
Yes,
Motter?
it did. We went down. My father went before he'd let them wake me because my husband was supposed to be on the train. But he didn't make the train that night, for which we were very grateful.
What time of the day or night did this crash happen?
Well, it was evidently in the early morning.
About 6 or 7.
About 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning.
It was early.
Getting back to this mine disaster now, did we find out exactly which mine that was that
I believe it
flooded?
must have been the Cameron. It was down near Coal Creek, where close to where the football stadium is now.
I
Down
see,
in that area, as I remember it. Is that your recollection? No?
I can't help you. I don't know exactly. I don't know exactly. You see, we have a large number of mines in the Henryetta area. At one time, we had in 1918, I believe, we had 38 coal mines operating in this area, and it's hard for me to remember the names of all of them or the one in which was involved.
Did anyone die in that mine flooding?
No.
In other words,
I don't remember that.
they were trapped in there for some time. How long were they trapped? Do you remember?
I don't know that.
Well, they were in quite a while, Mike, and I don't remember whether, I'm sure they were there a day or two anyway, because it was long enough, as Ed said, for the newsreel people to come in and set up. And the Red Cross had a headquarters there. They'd set up a tent and were prepared to do the things Red Cross usually does under those circumstances.
What year approximately was this?
I think it's 1926 or 27 along
That-
in
It was
there.
that early, I'm sure.
Around 1926 or 27, Ed, you started this little round off a minute ago when you brought these up. Can you remember anything else that is outstanding in Henrietta's history over the past 50 years or so?
Oh, my mind runs more to little incidents that happened and things of that nature more than it does ones of historical interest. I frankly don't know too much about the history of Henryetta. You know, the last few years, though, we've been very interested in trying to obtain a junior college for Henryetta. And it might be a surprise to some people to know that one time in the past, Henryetta had a junior college.
Well, I didn't know that.
And for 1 year.
One whole year.
One whole year. In the fall of 32 and the spring of 33, we had a junior college. Now, Ernest and I think we know why we had it, because he and I had just graduated from high school. Dad thought, and my dad and his dad thought we were too young to go off to the wild, wicked university, you know, so they got together and organized a junior college, so we'd have to stay home one more year. Now, whether that had any bearing on it, I don't know, but we always felt that it did.
Your dad, Ed, was the superintendent of the schools here?
Yes.
I imagine that the economy had something to do with it, too. We were in the bottom of the Depression in 1932. Henryetta was hard hit in the Depression. We had a lot of people that suffered during that period of time. And we did have a pretty good old junior college. We earned a full 32 hours of college credit, which at Oklahoma University, incidentally. This was a branch of Oklahoma University here. And we had 2 teachers, or 2 professors, if you want to call it. And I think we learned something.
Well, they were accredited professors. They were recommended by the University of Oklahoma, and they were hired on their recommendation, so they were well-qualified teachers.
Let me ask you why it only lasted 1 year.
Probably the economy again. I don't know whether...
I imagine the economy, and by that time Mr. Shaw had lost interest, you know. It was time for Edwin to go on to school, and...
I guess after 1 year of junior college, he decided it'd be better for you to go off to the university after all, maybe. I don't know.
Well, but maybe by then they had gotten money that they could make it over to Norman. That's my most vivid memory, probably, is the Depression days. But you go ahead.
I think people would be interested in Henryetta and the Depression. If you have something that you particularly recall about the Depression, I think they'd like to hear it.
You know, I was born during the Depression, but I don't remember anything. Is it true? Did they have the soup lines that you hear about?
We did. To get into the Depression, we lost our banks here. The mines were closed, and the professional people felt the pinch because people couldn't afford to pay fees. Everyone in Henryetta, I think, was affected by the Depression. There wasn't any place to turn. There was no welfare lines. Nothing you could turn to for welfare, Social Security, or anything like that. It just happened that my mother and father were real good friends of Bill Murray, since he had worked with him during his election and so forth.
So now, he was the first governor of Oklahoma.
Not the first governor.
I thought Alfalfa Bill Murray was the first governor of Oklahoma.
No, he was way down the line.
You haven't studied your history very well, Mike.
Well, it's been quite a few years. Who was the first governor of Oklahoma?
Mr. Haskell.
Mr. Haskell. Well, I've been lying to everybody over the radio here the last 4 or 5 days, because I thought Alfalfa Bill Murray was our first one, so I stand correct.
He was Henrietta's friend.
If we hadn't irritated Mr. Haskell, Henryetta would have been the county seat instead of Okmulgee, but we irritated the wrong man.
Maybe we should have had Alfalfa Bill as our first governor then. We would have had a county seat here.
Well, he was the best friend Henrietta has ever had, because after they let him know what was happening in Henrietta, and people were actually hungry. I've seen men and women cry from hunger and knowing that their children were hungry. So after the folks went over and talked to him, he came over to see firsthand, and we do have that picture out at the exhibit, just what was going on. And he had a very able secretary in Claude Weaver. Now, Ms. Weaver, Claude Weaver's wife, got busy with some of her friends in Oklahoma City. And you remember, or I suppose you remember, that Oklahoma City wasn't hit as early as Henrietta. So they gathered up huge boxes, and I mean huge boxes, of food and clothing and material. This was a real interesting time in my life, since I was expecting my first child. And along with making this layout, Mother and I together made 21 layouts that we gave to the women that just didn't have a stitch of clothes for their new babies. One of the interesting things that happened that time, a lady was visiting in our home, and we had fruit on our table. We were sitting by the dining table, and Mother offered her some fruit, and she started crying, and that, I guess, is the most vivid thing I remember. And she said, I couldn't eat a bite with my children hungry. So Mother just got a sack and dumped it along with everything in our kitchen. But We did then get some organized relief for Henryetta.
In what form did this organized relief come? Do you remember?
Well,
Was it-
first of all, it was in a committee, and then they started the WPA, and that was work, and the PWA, and
By this time, I guess Roosevelt had been elected and gotten some of his program started. I think he was elected in 32, wasn't he?
I believe.
Took office January the 20th, 1933, Mike, and we did have short...
32, when Bill Murray was running for president, you remember, and they went to Chicago to nominate him.
Bill tried, but he didn't make it. He was an interesting old character, though, Bill Murray was.
May I ask one question about Bill Murray before we go any further? Did he help frame the Oklahoma Constitution?
Yes.
Well, at least I'm right about one thing.
He was the president of the Constitutional Convention.
Well, maybe that's where I associated him directly with the early.
More than any other man, it is his handiwork.
You were going to say something about this, Mr. Smith, and I interrupted with that question. Go right ahead.
What were we talking about, Mike?
We were talking about the Depression days and Alfalfa Bill Murray and his.
We did have our problems during the Depression. Now, we don't want to just talk about all the bad things that's happened to Henryetta in times past, but we did have our problems in the Depression, and our people met it courageously. I think we had help, but not much. The Red Cross shipped in probably, I've seen the records on it, something in excess of $35,000 worth of flour, for example, that was used to make bread right here in Henryetta for people. But now, that lasted only a relatively short period of time, Mike, rather through the 30s, of course, but I mean over the overall history of the community. I think there's one thing here that we've skipped by that's of great interest. You know, the Henryetta community started initially, for example, we had about 25,000 people in the Henryetta area in 1918 when we grew up, and Mrs. Motter and Mrs. Gillette were here during that period. We used to have an interurban, and I don't know where it all ran to. Do you remember, Mrs. Motter, where it ran to?
No, I don't believe I do.
I know we had one that, we had a jumper that ran from here to Okmulgee, and if you wanted to go to county seat, you had to go that way.
Did it go to Coosa?
I understood we had one that went to Coosa.
But I'm not sure.
Coosa used to be a thriving community.
That's what I understand. Nick Hamra took me out there the other day just to show me where Coosa was, and I was amazed to see absolutely nothing there. And he described that there was a building here and streets running here, and now you see nothing but pasture. What do you remember about Coosa, Ernest?
Oh, I can remember when it had a lot of houses and 3 or 4 places of business in it, you know. But, of course, the houses were either burned or they moved them to some place where people want to live. Well, we had
quite a thriving place, too, you know, long back then.
Miss Gillette, which town did you say? Dewar.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, had 5,000 people at one time.
When you said there were close to how many thousand?
25,000 people in the Henryetta area. That's Dewar and Coosa and Bryant and Shooter, Colton, and just this immediate area.
Mm-hmm.
But we had so many coal mines, you see.
Ed, let me ask you what the prominent feature of Coosa was. I think there must have been something out there that caused the community to grow. Was it a coal mine or what?
No, I think probably the smelter. There was a large smelter there, I understand, during World War I period and shortly after. In fact, there were 3 smelters in the Henryetta area at one time. And 5.
5 smelters, altogether. And I think the last one to finally close down was the Eagle Pitcher, which was the largest. Am I mistaken?
No.
That's right. It was built here in 1916.
And it was the largest.
Much the largest.
About our economy more, the Henryetta economy more than the others probably, when they closed, don't you think?
Oh yes, the smelter workers nearly all lived right here in the area and are real good citizens.
What are some of the other things that you can remember as citizens of Henryetta back during those times? Be thinking, why don't you, of something that was funny that might have happened. I remember someone telling me the incident. Mrs. Gillette says that Mrs. Motter has some pretty good tales, and why doesn't she tell those?
Maybe Miss Motter can't tell them.
Maybe she doesn't think she should.
Sullins, when you went riding with them.
Oh. Well, the first automobiles that were brought to town, a young man that I knew brought them, and the Sullins family bought one of them, and Dr. Sanderson bought the other. And we went for a ride, all of us, and enjoyed it. Finally, the Sullins went home, and Cliff got in the car by himself. And he went around the block and around and around, and his brother stood out there. Well, stop, I want to ride. I want to drive that car. He said, I don't know how to stop it.
So, did he ever get it stopped?
Well, somehow someone told him what to do. That reminds me of my father when he was learning to drive. He took my little boy, he was 5 years old, and went out toward Creek Mines. And he got out there, and my little boy was standing up by the front. And he said, Grandpa, we're running away. And he said, son, I know it, and I don't know how to stop it. And he said, oh, you just turn the key, Grandpa. My father came back, and he never drove a car again. He said, I almost killed myself and your son.
I wonder how he felt having a little 5-year-old boy tell him how to stop a car.
He wanted to know how it happened. He asked her how it happened, that he knew.
Well, he and I made many trips alone. We'd drive to Dallas because my husband was an engineer and he was away from home a lot. And I taught him how to stop the car, and I told him what to do in case anything happened to Mother, or if we had a wreck and he was still living. I didn't want him to be hurt. And I taught him to put his foot on the brake and get a hold of the wheel and hold it, but to turn that key first and let it stop.
Mike, I think we'd be amiss if we didn't mention some of the builders of Henryetta. I think the people that build things for our community, most of us don't stop to think, that we ride on streets that we didn't build and sidewalks we didn't build and go to school a lot of times in schools we didn't build and live in houses that we didn't build. But some of our builders were men like J.R. Reynolds, who Mrs. Motter and Ms. Gillette have told you built buildings here in Henryetta. W.B. Hudson, the Hudson family were prominent in Henryetta, and a number of buildings on Main Street and off Main Street were built by W.B. Hudson. And Barclay Morgan was a prominent builder. I believe he built the Morgan Building, did he not? The Opera House, we call it, and the Morgan Theater where the skating rink is, and a lot of houses and different things. And I think we would be amiss if we pass by the builders.
Raised $5,000 in 1 hour to help out on the First Baptist Church building when it was built. Do you remember that, or was that a little early, Ernest?
No, I don't remember Barclay raising the $5,000.
Not from himself, but it was taken up in 1 hour's time. He also built the Morgan block of all new homes, and at that time those were really the swank homes, There's a gas well on the Morgan block that he capped off, so someday maybe someone will strike another gas well.
I'd little rather you didn't talk about that. I think there's a lot of geologists think that Henryetta sits on a gas field, and I'm very hopeful that nobody ever finds out, because I've passed a good many titles in this area, that might be in jeopardy if that happens.
Oh my, there certainly is a lot of history involved in the Henryetta area, and how about the schools? Are there any things that you can remember about the schools? Now, Mr. Shaw, your dad was the superintendent here. Anything that you can remember, any experiences that your dad had as being superintendent here that would be maybe humorous or of historical value, do you think? When were the schools organized here in Henryetta? About?
You're long before my time. I don't know
About
just when they were
1902.
organized, but I'm sure back in the teens, probably prior to World War
I think
I.
1902 was the first school here, I believe. Maybe it was too small to be organized because they only had one teacher, and I believe it was in the Clark residence.
Presbyterian Church, I think.
I think
may
they
have
met
been
at home first, Ernest, and then in the Presbyterian Church.
I see.
I could be wrong about that, but that's what I remembered, and it was down on, 6th, 7th on Gentry, somewhere down in that area.
Ed, when did your dad come here as superintendent?
We came here in 1926, and shortly after we came here, Ed Battles came as a young graduate from college, and I believe this was probably his first teaching position. And he was here for many years following Dad. And oh, I don't know, I look back and think of some of the early teachers. I remember when Miss Elizabeth Cameron graduated from OU and came back and began teaching here as a young teacher. And I remember seeing her walk down the street on a rainy day with her raincoat on, had written on the back, "OU Kid," I believe it was. She was a graduate of OU, I take it. And
Remember the Embry girls?
Yes, the Embrys, and I
Those
think
were our
anyone that's
first
gone to
teachers.
school here would remember Miss Margaret and Miss Josephine Embry, and of course Miss Carr, who was the school librarian.
And Sammy.
And
Did she not teach?
Sammy,
I don't think Sammy taught. I think wasn't she the clerk of the board for a long time?
I think she was for many
Secretary
years.
of the board.
The first building that we can call school was the Lyceum building that's been torn down, and it was next to the where the junior high is now, that used to be the high school. The first year that it was in operation, I had a little brother and sister going that much before I was born. I think about, 1906, 1907, Ernest, do you know?
I really don't know.
I think
I
it was
know.
about 6 or 7, somewhere along in there. Miss Embry was one of the first teachers.
And I think one of the best loved teachers that we ever had here was, of course, Miss Lita Bowles.
That's
Yes.
right.
And I think everyone likes to recall how she could walk into a room and just hold her hand up and say, "Someone in this room is chewing some spearmint gum, and I'll give you 2 minutes to get it out of your mouth," or "Someone here has some double mint gum in her mouth." She could tell what kind it was by the smell. And all she ever had to do was just say, "I smell the gum," and that took care of it.
Do you remember
Then
Miss
the theory
Harriet?
was that if anyone
That's the one.
had gum in their mouth and
Harriet.
working their jaw, when their jaw started working, it automatically threw their mind out of gear. So we didn't chew gum in school in those days.
Now, I think I remember one time that Ernest and, was it Ed Shaw, that had the debate in Latin in Ms. Marriott's room?
Well, now, if we had a debate, in Latin, somebody else did the talking, because
I remember you did pretty good.
we did have a good student, Maury Hill. Do you remember
Yes, I
Maury?
remember Maury.
Maury could read Latin. And we used to, the way we read our Latin each day was Maury would read it to us ahead of time, and then we'd go in and read it.
But Ms. Marriott was one teacher in a million. I'll never forget her.
You know, we hear about how rambunctious, for search of a better term, the younger generation is now. Did youngsters your age back during high school, did you do anything as bad as what our young people do these days?
No, what we did then was good, clean fun.
Tell us a little bit about some of that good, clean fun that you all used to have. Were you in on that? Were you in on that incident where somebody took some water up and threw it over on the principal or something as he came in the school building or something? Do you know what I'm talking
No,
about?
I don't remember.
Somebody told me about that incident. What were some others that you can recall, Ed? The things that happened back during your high school?
Well, I don't want to mention any names because some of them might be present, I don't know, but I remember someone crawling out the second-story window on the south side of the high school building one day. And, of course, that's where the junior high is now. That was the old high school building then. In fact, there were several of the boys that came out.
Through that same window?
I believe so.
I remember one thing about schools that we haven't mentioned is when we had a cave-in, when our mines were all in operation. Mike probably doesn't know that we're more than likely sitting on a mine right now. But my first year in school at the Irving School, it was a 2-story brick building down on 12th, which Irving is now, or where the Irving was last year. But one night, or at least before time for school the next day, and I can't remember if this was summer or winter, if we were in school, but I know it was my first year that the building caved in, so we were scattered here and there, and I went to school in the basement of the First Baptist Church.
Any other school experiences? How about you?
We had good football teams in the 20s.
We sure
We
did.
played one, we can well remember when in 25, 26 we played McAllister for the state championship on Henrietta's field. I think we won it 35-19 is my recollection. And that's the picture that Mildred has. I wanted her to display showing the old automobiles around the field. We didn't have stands. People walked up and down the field until the 30s. But we had some good football teams in the 20s, in
You know,
particular.
when Ernest was on the team, they made a mistake and threw him with the football.
That must have been why they were so good. See,
They had an extra heavy football.
just give the football to Ernest, and then pick Ernest up and throw him. And
We were state champions, and what else did we do? Did we have an all-star, Ernest? Do you remember?
Did we have an all-star? Yes, Lawrence Kruger was all-state end, and then Howard Lamb was an all-state guard. And we may have had some other all-states in the 20s. I don't remember exactly at that time.
I don't remember either, but I know in 1927, I believe it was, our high school team was good enough that we went to Oklahoma City University and played their freshman football team one game. OCU had some pretty good football teams back in those days.
Well, let's see. We've talked about the Depression, and we've talked about some of the builders. We have about 13, 14 more minutes on the program this morning. There's two areas I'd like to cover before it's over, and one of them would be some of the more colorful people that were here and helped Henrietta grow. And then I'd also like to talk a little bit about the PPG plant, some of the things that went into bringing PPG in. Of course, that's our biggest industry in town right now, and probably one of the larger contributors to our local economy. Who are some of the more prominent? I've heard doctors mentioned. I've heard lawyers mentioned as being very key figures in the development of Henrietta. Can you recall some of these people, Mr. Smith?
Yes, we've had some colorful characters in our past. We've mentioned some of them, like Barclay Morgan. And Hugh Henry was obviously a colorful individual, one of the earliest settler we have here. Dr. I.W. Bollinger was a very colorful individual. In many ways, Dr. Mooney, Dr. Sanderson. You remember Dr. Sanderson had the baseball team. Henrietta had a professional baseball team. We didn't mention that, did we? We had a professional baseball team back in the early 20s, and we played Joplin and Fort Smith and Chickasha and Okmulgee, and I know we have played Springfield, Missouri. We played with the big boys. We played in the Western Association. We had a field and a regular professional baseball team. We always doctored that up a little bit at the end of the season when we had our grudge match with Okmulgee, and each team brought in major leaguers to replace some of their regulars. But then that's another story. But we were talking about colorful characters. Dr. Sanderson was one of the owners.
E.W. Smith had offices right up here for 40 years. Out here.
Now, this E.W. Smith must be related to Ernest.
He must be. Ernest's father.
You want to go way back?
He was one of the first renters. He had it reserved when my father finished the building. He was there when he passed away.
Now, this picture you're showing
Still
me,
renting, I mean.
yeah, this picture you're showing me where Ernest's father rented his offices, it says Al Drug here. I believe that's now Mowdy Drug, is that right?
Yes.
On the corner of 4th and Main, and it was in that upstairs area.
Yes,
And,
he was upstairs.
And Mrs. Motter, you say that Ernest's father was one of your first renters, one of your dad's first renters.
Yes, and kept that office until he passed away.
Who are some of the...
He was a very pleasant renter. We always enjoyed him and loved him, really.
And Ernest, I bet you were a little bit partial, too.
Well, I was partial towards him also.
Who are some of the other colorful people that you can remember? How about you, Ed, or...
Well,
I was going back to the very early days when my own father came here. Perry Pan, and Woodpoke and Mitchell all had dray businesses here. If you wanted anything moved, you had to call or get one of them. You couldn't call, you had to go get them. But I can remember my daddy talking about hauling things to the Reynolds and to the Burnett's. They were early builders. And on one occasion, my little brother had been up to Burnett's, and in those days you had the kegs of nails. And this is one of the early lessons I learned, and I've never forgotten. But while Mother was shopping, he picked up nails and put it in his pocket and carried them home. And when Mother looked out, he's pounding nails in the ground. So she, where did you get the nails? And he said, they just have all kinds of nails up there, just kegs and kegs. So she made him march right back up and take the nails back. Mr. Burnett's told me about this, too.
There's you another one, H.D. Burnett, that was here for your Joe's daddy. Founded, used to be Burnett and Moore hardware store. As I said, W.B. Hudson, we mustn't forget our coal operators, Earl Wells and M.A. Berman.
Hammers were early merchants.
The Hammers were early merchants here, the Steckelbergs, the Wise family.
Who are the
Mrs.
Tucks
J.H.
now.
Bruton.
Yes,
That's right.
Mrs. J.H. Bruton, and of course we don't want to forget our survivor, Lee Bursler, who kind of spans the entire area, you know, and knew all of these people.
Well, like, you know, they had their pictures made for 50 years. They had 59.
That is true.
That is true. The Hardin Studio goes down in history, I think, as recording history.
We don't want to forget the Stormonts, the enforcement, the policemen and sheriffs of our area for a great number of years, and the Tates.
I would like to bring out the thought here that Mrs. Walker had about the Hardin studio. Of course, your stepfather was Joe Hardin, and he was the official photographer for this whole part of the state. And of course, your pictures are on display out at the National Guard Army for the rest of today and tomorrow as part of Henryetta, and we certainly would advise everyone to go out and look, because practically every incident, practically every name that we've mentioned on the program or that our guests have mentioned are in one way represented in this tremendous array of pictures out there. So if you want to see what we've been talking about, go out there, and you'll be out there too to talk to them,
Oh,
won't you?
that's true, and we had an enormous crowd last night in spite of all this rainy weather.
So don't let the weather keep you from going out there and looking this over. Now, in the few minutes remaining, let's talk a little bit about PPG Industries. This was quite an achievement, I think, at the time. Mr. Smith, do you remember? Now, I do remember in the Hardin collection out there at the National Guard Army, there are pictures of the groundbreaking ceremony. There were very many dignitaries there. There was a lot going on. Who was responsible for the PPG coming here? And I'm sure that the city of Henryetta did a lot of ambassadorial work to get PPG in.
Well, I don't know the names of all the parties. I know some that worked real hard on it. Includes the aforementioned Lee Bursler, Dr. I.W. Bollinger, and of course there were many others. And you just hear about certain ones of them, and there were many others that had a very vital part, including my own father,
T-Bone McDonald.
T-Bone McDonald,
Wells, I think.
Earl Wells. Well, in fact, I would say that the whole community really had a part in this thing. Wherever they were needed, they were glad to do whatever they could. Everybody had something to do with it. Mrs. Grant's father, Ms. Rita Grant's father, came here initially for Pittsburgh Plate. His name was Octave Jackman, and he came and was the initial builder of the plant. He came to supervise and to handle the initial construction.
About what year are we talking about? Do you remember?
1929.
My school was let out that day. The day that we had the opening. Do you remember that?
They
That was
just
a
turned.
holiday. We had a big parade.
Had a big parade and turned school out for the groundbreaking ceremonies. And
No, well, I don't remember that, but we did have a parade down Main Street, didn't we, Ernest? Am I off on that?
Well, we usually paraded on about any excuse, and I imagine we did, Mildred.
Well, I have a picture that I'm sure is the day that it was. And you remember that J.C. Penney came to Henryetta at the same time.
Yes,
We're
their
beginning
their
to
building, I
see.
guess, J.C. Penney building's about the newest one on Main Street, except those that have been built in the last 15 years, 15, 20 years.
But PPG came in 1929, right? And it's still here and still going strong. Any things that we need to mention here in the few remaining moments that we haven't covered
Well, we have a radio station here now.
yet? Well, yes, we do, and we know that we're going to be here for another 50 years. I'm sorry that KHEN wasn't part of the early day history that we've been discussing mostly, but I think probably it hadn't been invented by that time. We would like to...
Excuse me, Mike.
Yes.
We failed to mention one of our earliest, one of our best boosters was George Riley Hall, who founded the Henryetta Daily Freelance, and through all of the years was known and beloved by all of our people.
A booster.
Ed can tell you what the freelance cost during the Depression years.
Yes, I was a paper boy during the time I was in high school, and the dues were 10 cents a week. Dues, I don't know whether you want to call them dues or not.
Well, that's
And
about what they
you'd be
were.
surprised how hard it was to collect 10 cents a week from those customers. I had 125 customers that I carried to, and if I could get 3/4 of them collected a week, I'd be doing good. But a lot of people, they just couldn't pay the dime, and finally we just have to stop leaving the paper.
Was this was back during the Depression?
Yes, in the 30s, in 30, 31, 32, long in there.
I would like to say that we have some early editions of the Henryetta Freelance on display as part of the historical display at the National Guard. Go by and read those. And I think George Riley Hall himself wrote his impression of Henrietta's history in this in one particular part of this newspaper display, and it's a very vivid account of some of the things that we've been talking about and some of the people that were involved. And I think this would be a very interesting thing for anyone who's really interested in the history of Henryetta to stop by and look at this. Mr. Hall, did he organize the newspaper? Was he the founder of the Daily Freelance?
Yes.
He was the founder, and
Yes.
I remember the
Mhm.
brother-in-law of, who was our poet?
Meacham.
Lloyd.
Well, no, he was the poet laureate.
Laureate himself.
Well, his Posey. Wasn't Alex Posey his brother-in-law, the Indian poet that wrote the beautiful poetry? You'll find he wrote several books. That there was Mrs. Hall's brother was Alex Posey. There's a book of his poetry that's just beautiful, and in the council house in Oak Moody, some of it's on display.
George Riley Hall, another of the great names that went down in history and caused the history of Henryetta to be so colorful. Well, our time has run out. We would like to say that this program has been recorded, of course, as we've been sitting here live talking, and the tape of this program will go in the time capsule, which will be buried this afternoon at 4:30 here in Henryetta. And this time capsule will be dug up in 50 years in the year 2022. And we hope that you folks in the year 2022 have enjoyed hearing us talk about the first 50 years of Henrietta's history. And of course we know that there will be another colorful 50 years coming up, and I certainly intend to be here all that time to see what it's going to be like. We want to thank Ernest Smith, Ed Shaw, along with Mrs. Arthur Walker, Mildred Walker, Mrs. Mame Gillette, and her sister, Mrs. L.D. Motter, for being with us on our Coffee Talk program today. We want to thank our sponsors who have relinquished their commercial time on the program this morning so that we may use the entire 55 minutes of discussion for this very important program. Thank you very much for listening, and we want to thank once again our very special guests, Mrs. Arthur Walker, Mrs. Mame Gillette, Mrs. L.D. Motter, and Ernest Smith and Ed Shaw. And that's it for another Coffee Talk program.
Good things come in small packages. Sears can prove this to anyone with a hearing problem. Sears Hearing Aid Consultant will be in Okmulgee the fourth Monday of each month, and in town.